Hello, I'm Gill at engVid, and today we have a lesson on metaphors. We've done metaphors before. You'll find I have a few other lessons that refer to metaphors. This one is about colourful metaphors that you would find perhaps in the news, in references to politics and politicians. So this colourful metaphors in itself is a metaphor. To call a metaphor colourful, you can see it's written in red, so in a sense it's literally colourful, but metaphorically these metaphors are very, very strong. They're meant to have a strong impact and to create a strong picture in your mind. Okay, so that's the point of metaphors. Another word for metaphors is imagery. So it creates a picture, an image in your mind. Okay, and they're often very, they have a big impact when you hear them, more than just ordinary neutral language. So, for example, when people are talking about large sums of money, especially when to do with a government and how much money they're spending on something, it's called eye-watering sums of money. Eye-watering means, you know, your eyes are watering, or the tears are coming from your eyes because the amounts of money are so big. But also I think people's eyes water if they're in pain. So the idea is that the amounts of money being spent, it's painful to think about. The kind of money that's had to be spent during the COVID pandemic, for example. In the UK, a lot of money was spent trying to protect people's jobs. People were put on furlough, which meant that their money was coming from the government rather than from the company that employed them. And the government was spending huge amounts of money on that to help to preserve people's jobs so that they didn't lose their job, so that the company didn't fail, and so on. So billions and billions of pounds were spent. So that was eye-watering sums were being spent on that employment scheme, for example. Okay, and then more recently we've had this quotation from one politician in the UK, the leader of the opposition, accused the Prime Minister of leading his troops through the sewer, which sounds rather strange. I think the word troops you would normally have in the army, and these would be soldiers rather than, you know, MPs, but that's part of the metaphor. We've got a sort of army metaphor, as well as mention of a sewer, which is where, well, when you flush the toilet, everything goes down under the ground through the pipes in the sewer, the sewage system. So it's a disgusting thing to think about. For the leader of the opposition to say that the Prime Minister is leading his troops, meaning his MPs, through the sewer, this was a recent situation where the government were being accused of corruption or trying to manipulate the political system in a certain way. They had a vote in Parliament about something, to try to get around a problem rather than to deal with the problem properly. They were trying to get round the problem and to try to avoid doing what they should have been doing. And the opposition and people generally thought it was a rather sort of corrupt thing to do. So this was the description. The Prime Minister is leading his troops through the sewer, and it's a very sort of unpleasant image for something that was a rather unpleasant situation. And then something similar to that. Well, what happened after this, the next day, the government decided, oh dear, we'd better not do that then. It's causing so much trouble. We won't do that. We'll change our minds. So what they did a U-turn. They were going to do things a certain way, and they'd won the vote that allowed them to do it that way, but it had caused so much trouble, they decided, oh no, we'd better not do that. We will look really bad if we go ahead with that. So they did a U-turn. So doing a U-turn in a literal sense is usually if you're driving a car or any vehicle and you're going along the road, but then you want to turn round and go back the other way, go back the same way you just came. So you go in a U shape. You're going this way, and then you turn and go back the other way, and you're sort of creating the shape of a letter U. So to do a U-turn. And in driving, when people learn to drive, they learn how to do a U-turn. So that's often used, especially with the present government. They do tend to do U-turns every now and then. They've said, we're going to do this. For example, everyone should wear a mask. But then a few days later, they might say, oh no, people don't have to wear a mask anymore. Only, if you're going shopping, if you're in a shop, wear a mask, but otherwise you don't need to. So, if the government keeps changing their minds, it's very confusing for people. But, that's how it's described, doing a U-turn. And then, again, not long ago, one politician called some other politicians, a politician called another politician scum, again, through doing things a little bit unconventionally, trying to do something a little bit in a sort of not a very honest way, perhaps. And scum literally is something unpleasant sort of floating on the top of some liquid, sort of dirt floating on the liquid. If you see these pictures of polluted rivers and so on with sort of chemicals floating on top, it looks horrible. So scum, you can call people scum, but it's a very strong term. It's not a good idea to call somebody scum. And after the politician had called the other politician scum, she was asked if she was going to apologise for using that word, because she'd sort of used it in private. She hadn't really said it publicly, but she had been heard saying it. And then she refused to apologise for quite a while. But then after maybe a few weeks, she did eventually say she was sorry to have used that word scum about another politician. Okay. Right, so then this one, the final whistle hasn't blown yet. So this normally, in a literal sense, is in a sports game, perhaps football, when at the end of the football match, the referee blows a whistle to stop the game because the time is up. So that's literally the final whistle when the game comes to an end. But this was used recently by a medical officer who advises the UK government on COVID and on lockdowns and wearing masks and vaccinations and everything connected with COVID. And he was talking about COVID and how some people had sort of relaxed a lot. They'd stopped wearing masks. They'd started mixing with other people, getting a bit too close perhaps, not doing any social distancing. And he was saying people have started to think that COVID has gone away, and it hasn't. He was trying to get a strong message across that COVID is still around. We're still, at risk of infection and serious illness and so on. So he said the final whistle hasn't blown yet. It's not the end of the story yet. So I think that particular person is well known for his colourful metaphors, often to do with football or other sorts of images, to try to get a strong message across to people that will influence their behaviour so that they will behave sensibly and not help to increase the infection rate. Okay. Then just a few sort of general metaphors that are often used in politics. The elephant in the room. That's when people are discussing an issue, but they're not really talking about the main issue. They might be talking about small things when there's a much bigger thing to talk about. So it could be something like the elephant in the room, could be climate change, for example. That's the really big issue. And then if politicians are talking about some small details, they are ignoring the elephant in the room. If there's an elephant in the room, literally, you would know about it because it's so big. So that's the idea. Okay. And then a tectonic shift. If there's been quite a big change in something, like maybe recently there's been a climate change conference, you could say it was quite a good, progress, quite good progress was made. I don't know whether you'd say it was a tectonic shift. That remains to be seen in what actually happens next. It was all based on talking and creating a document for people to agree to. It's what people do next that matters. We need a tectonic shift in the way what people do next in terms of trying to reduce climate change. But tectonic shift in a literal sense is to do with tectonic plates in the earth, where the things that create earthquakes, if there's a tectonic shift, that often causes an earthquake and maybe a tsunami, waves coming in from the sea. So a tectonic shift is a big movement of the ground underneath, under our feet, and it can cause earthquakes and tremors and so on. So that's quite a big thing. So if there is a tectonic shift in the way people behave to do with climate change, that is what we need to reduce global warming. Okay, so next one, a landslide victory. That's usually when there's an election, people are voting for different parties, and then if one party wins by a large number of votes, that's called a landslide victory. So in a literal sense, a landslide is when, if there's a hill or a mountain, but then all the earth, often when it's rained a lot, when it's been raining a lot and there's a lot of water collected in the earth that's piled up, it sort of slides down rather dramatically, and suddenly you see it sliding down like this. So that's quite a dramatic thing. So a landslide victory is when one particular party gets a large number of votes, maybe unexpectedly, because landslides in the real world are also unexpected as well. They just happen suddenly. Okay. Mudslinging, again in politics, this is what opposing parties do. They sling or throw mud at each other. They kind of accuse each other of bad things, and if you throw mud at somebody, it's sticky, so it will stick all over them, over their face and their clothes. So mudslinging, if both sides are doing it, then both sides will end up covered in mud, and it's to make each other look bad. So, okay. And then finally, a witch hunt. At one time in history, women in particular were accused of being witches and were persecuted, even executed for being a witch. And so this term is used sometimes by politicians nowadays if they're being accused of doing something wrong and they want to stand up against it. They will call it a witch hunt to make it sound as if it's not a valid criticism. One particular politician used to do this, who was in power, isn't in power anymore. Every time that politician was accused of some sort of corruption or hiding something, or having done something wrong in secret, that politician would just say, "Oh, it's a witch hunt. It's just a witch hunt. I didn't do anything wrong. It's a witch hunt." It's to sort of discredit the people who are making the criticism, to try to get out of it and say, no, it's not a valid criticism. Okay, so I hope that's an interesting set of colourful metaphors for you. If you'd like to do a quiz on this subject, just go to the website, engVid.com, and try the quiz. And thanks for watching, and hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.